full year for all involved and especially the field. And I think in that vein, sort of before we turn it over, a really packed and robust and important agenda, I would just close out this calendar year by reiterating our tremendous gratitude for the field, the providers, those who are leading the providers, the children and families who are part of the EEC community. As a board, we continue to stand with you. We have a lot of ongoing conversation about ways to continue to support the field during this time. We look ahead to 2021 with some optimism, but certainly the next few months will continue to be challenging. And we stand ready as a board to continue to support the commissioner and her team as they support the field right across the state. So just framing that up, we have had a really nice cadence to these board meetings this fall, where the commissioner has very thoughtfully structured these meetings. I think today is a great example. We're looking to zero in on the educators to keep building off the strategic planning of early 20, which of course feels now like worlds ago, but is still just incredibly relevant and salient to our work. And so there are a few pieces to that agenda item, and then we will talk a little about the budget and a spending update. I will turn it over to the Secretary. Any comments?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to obviously reiterate the expression of gratitude and thanks that the chair started the meeting with. This has been, needless to say, an unusual year, unfortunate in many ways, but really a reflection of the capacity of the early education field to rise to the occasion under very difficult circumstances. And so I do, I wish I could say now the year's over and we're back to normal. That's obviously not the case. But nonetheless, I think we enter 2021 with a sense of hope, but also with a deep sense of gratitude for what's gone on over the past year. So thank you all for that. As the chair mentioned, the FY21 budget is still in process. Although we are within days of the finish line, we'll obviously have a chance to discuss the state of play towards the end of today's meeting, so I don't really need to add anything now. As we speak, the governor is holding a press conference to update some general COVID guidance in light of the overall increase in cases and hospital utilization and other indicators. Rather than try to summarize the governor's announcement here, I'll just advise everyone to go to the mass.gov website for details. I don't think there's anything that he'll be announcing today that will have much of a direct impact on EEC licensed programs, but we'll make sure to follow up if there are any indirect effects or things that may be more subtle that need further exploration and explanation. And finally, just sort of more broadly, we continue to work with school districts to reopen their classrooms for in-person instruction. Last week, Commissioner Riley sent letters to 3 urban districts asking for information regarding in-person instruction and supports for special needs students, including plans for bringing all or most of those children back into school as soon as possible. And this is on top of similar audits that the commissioner has initiated in a number of communities with relatively low COVID caseloads that have been fully remote since basically the beginning of the school year. These targeted actions on the part of the department are part of a broader effort to bring K-12 students back into their schools. As I think you all know, throughout the fall, there's been a growing consensus among public health officials, epidemiologists, pediatricians, and educators that schools are not sources of significant COVID spread as long as the basic health and safety protocols are followed. And that's true even in areas with high caseloads. Equally important in communities with significant spread, schools are often safer places for children than many home environments that may lack the same level of consistent supervision and compliance with health and safety standards. The same is true, of course, for the programs that we oversee. In many cases, those hours that children are spending in those programs are as safe or safer than the environments that children are coming from. Obviously, we're approaching the end of the first half of the school year, so we're hoping that we can work with districts to bring more children back into school come January. And with that, Madam Chair, let me turn it back over to you.
Great. I'll turn it over.
Yes, thank you so much, Secretary, Madam Chair. I wanted to start just by having a slightly more thoughtful reaction to the feedback that you all provided last time to the work in the year that we've had so far, and wanted to really just honestly thank you all for the opportunity to do this and for the continued collaboration and feedback. I cannot tell you how honored I am to be welcomed back so wonderfully to the Commonwealth, not only by the board, but I think particularly by the field, and the commitment of the field to endure this time, to thrive and to learn from, but also the willingness to collaborate on what is inevitably going to be difficult changes that that we will co-construct together. So appreciate the feedback, appreciate the commitment, and the wanted to publicly also just appreciate the outpouring of feedback I got from the field after the last meeting as well. That said, as we hone in on the path forward, I am thoughtfully taking the priorities for the year ahead, and will be presenting to the board in January goals for the year to ensure that we are all on the same page on not only what my goals are, but how those contribute to the overall objectives of the department and the work we're doing together. In the meantime, as the Secretary alluded to, as the rapidly changing landscape that we are in the midst of right now, not only from the health standpoint, as we see numbers rising after the holidays, and thinking about how we continue to protect childcare, I just want to reiterate, while we definitely are seeing a mirroring in childcare of an increase in the cases overall, though we are still seeing our exposures mitigated by the really commitment to the protocols that are in place. And so while our communities are seeing increased risk, our childcare remains a safe space for children and for the workforce. We see childcare providers making very difficult decisions every day in favor of mitigating the risk and exposure. And we still continue to see very, very limited potential in center transmission, and really seeing that that while the community it does provide risk to childcare, that the childcare is a safe community member to be to be able to care for our children in this time. So I wanted to highlight that given where we're seeing the numbers overall, and continue to respond to and engage with childcare to make sure that they are supported in being able to continue those practices. We know that as the state pivots to thinking about vaccinations and a different time in the COVID recovery, we continue to have conversations with all of those in response to not only what we're hearing from the field and from the board, but also to fit into the broader landscape of the Commonwealth as we invest in towards recovery from the pandemic. And so just want to assure that as those conversations are rapidly happening, that we are working, EEC team is working quickly to make sure that that continues to be part of the conversation as it relates to childcare as well. And with that, I will turn it back over to you, Madam Chair.
Questions, comments for the Secretary for Commissioner before we launch into the agenda items?
Yes, Noni.
Go ahead, Sheila.
For the Commissioner, just a question regarding the vaccinations that you just mentioned. I wonder, what is the status of child care workers with regard to priority for receiving those, vaccines?
Yeah, I will respond to this in as much as we have thus far been able to be thoughtful about where they might be positioned, but also make sure that the Secretary who may have a different lens or information, please feel free to interrupt or correct me where I may not be as up to date. I think as you all know, the federal government and the state government are in the process of putting together priorities across all of the waves of vaccination rollout. And while the first wave, obviously, from the CDC guidance, it impacts the most critical populations as have been decided. I think what we're looking at is where childcare becomes positioned in relation to education versus the critical infrastructure around being able to serve those those people who are going back to work. We've been hearing a lot from the healthcare community around concerns of keeping childcare open, and so looking to be able to engage in conversations about where childcare fits based on the needs and the priorities of the workforce who is reliant on it.
Yeah, I think the field would certainly emphasize and be enthusiastic about the notion that there is a dependency relationship between many of the first responders and the health care infrastructure, as you suggest, and childcare. People are depending on us. Families are depending on us. The workforce out there is depending on us. So I certainly would encourage us to be counted among, a top priority for receiving the vaccine.
Yeah, last month you heard the commissioner say that Nikki and Allison and I had started to put our heads together as sort of a small working group on this issue. I think the next stage is to try to meet with the vaccine readiness group to sort of not make the case in the sense that this is important for everybody, but to your point, Sheila, there's a timing and a prioritization that's going to happen, and this is a workforce that has in technical terms worked effectively almost right through the pandemic, that is an interdependency in infrastructure terms, but also on many individual indicators of vulnerable population. So I would like to see the two come together and result in the priority placement in the vaccine rollout. So I want to thank Nikki and Allison for their partnership. We're scheduled to meet again this week, and then I would like to engage you all in some of that thinking before we talk with the vaccine readiness group. But I couldn't agree with you more, and I think it's particularly important because I don't think we have lifted up this population enough as a state in the last many months. I mean, I think we have worked hard, and I think the field has worked hard, but I think we could stand to do really right by them in the vaccine process.
Thank you.
Anything else on that count, or anything else for the commissioner or the secretary? Okay, let's turn now to the minutes from the November 10th meeting, which looked fine to me. I don't know if others had any suggested edits or amendments, corrections. Okay, otherwise, I will make the motion that we approve the minutes from the November 10th, 2020 board meeting. Can I get a second?
Second.
Thank you. And I'm just going to go through on my screen. Secretary Pizer.
Aye.
Mary Wallachie.
Yes.
Joan Wasser-Gish.
Yes.
Sheila Balboni.
Yes.
Carolyn Kane.
Yes.
Joni Block.
Yes.
Eleonora Villegas Reimers.
Yes.
Nikki Ruiz de Luzuriaga.
Yes.
Allison Schoenwald.
Yes.
David Cruz.
Yes.
Thank you. All right, let's turn now to the items for discussion and action. We'll start with a briefing on the program opening and enrollment data, understanding that this is a squishy space, but worth trying to scope each month.
So I wanted to highlight for those of you following along at home that we restructured the slides a little bit this month in order to be able to make sure that we had fostering time for conversation. And so you do have more of the data at the back of the slide deck in the appendix, but highlighted, if we move to the next slide, highlighted some of the key takeaways that we were seeing in that data that offered us an opportunity to answer any questions and dig a little bit deeper. So I won't read all of these to you, but I wanted to highlight a couple of things as we've gone through here. We still are ahead of many states in our reopening capacity, and that there is 82% of our providers who have come back into the system and or come new into the system. So just to clarify, that isn't all returning providers. We do have some new providers. and as I have been talking and thinking about this, and while that is really great, what we're hearing back is many of those are at a level of vulnerability that could easily put us behind the country quickly as well, which I think is the thing that we wanted to highlight here. I also want to highlight that as we have seen more programs close over the last month, and so we have been seeing accelerated closures as well. So from this, the other thing that's a little bit confusing in here, but we're trying to parse out, is you have our licensing reopening data, and then we also have our information that came as a self-reported survey that we've been talking to you all about. We didn't reach the numbers we saw in the first round of response rates, but given the distribution of responses that we saw, we did aggregate that and try to apply it to all of our opening programs to give you some sense of what enrollment or attendance could look like. So when you see usage there, you do have what the 63% and 54% of utilization that is indicative of those who responded to us. And then the numbers that when you apply that percentage to our overall system, this is what attendance and enrollment would look like. So it's a very rough estimate, but it is one of the best overall estimates we were able to get. So we didn't want to miss the opportunity to do that with you all. So you see that really does highlight the vulnerability of the field, that when we don't see our utilization rates up enough, that we are that our opening providers are really struggling financially to maintain as well. The other thing that I wanted to highlight is the staffing impact as well. So again, a little bit hard to parse out, but when you look at the staffing rates that we're seeing versus the attendance rates or enrollment rates, is you're seeing that people haven't cut back on staff at the rate that enrollment has dropped. And while there's many reasons for that, when we look anecdotally and ask questions from the field to ask, why haven't you? Obviously, people are trying to keep their staff on board. They're trying to maintain the workforce. But the other thing we hear resoundingly is that it takes more staff to operate right now. So these are some of the best numbers that we could try to approximate for that, which is the staffing rate that people have maintained and the enrollment rate that they are seeing, and seeing that it really does take additional investment in workforce to maintain a lower enrollment rate right now, given the recovery, given the pandemic. And I think that one of the things we'll have to pay attention to is what the trajectory of that looks like over recovery. So as we sort of return to a normal, it will be probably a place where we will continue to need additional staffing capacity for before we get back to a stabilized ratio of group size, depending also on what's happening in terms of intermingling of groups and things like that. So I'll pause there. Again, you have much more data in the appendix, but wanted to open it up for questions or thoughts and tried to highlight some of the things we think might be most pertinent from the new information.
Great. Just feel free to jump in. I can't see everybody as easily when there's a screen share, so I think just feel free to jump in right now without raising your hand necessarily. Any comments or questions for the commissioner on this?
Hi, it's Joni here. Hi. Thank you for this and all that other information. I'm wondering if there is any information about what some of our educators in the field are hearing from families that they're providing services for.
There is a lot in any specific area that you're interested in.
I'm just curious about what type of supports and resources families might be seeking other than the programmatic piece of it. And they, you know, I mean, they're also going along and putting out the fires on a daily basis. But I'm just wondering if we're hearing from programs what families might be addressing.
Absolutely. Yeah. I wasn't sure if you were hearing why they were why they're staying out versus the families who are showing up. So I wanted to address some of that. In terms of the needs of families who are showing up, and I think this does, again, speak to the staffing ratio too, there's a couple of things that we're hearing. The food security issue is huge in childcare, as we know, across the country. And we've been looking to try to make it easier for childcare to facilitate connections with school districts, for example, and we are hearing a lot of concern from providers of how they can get connected with resources. We have recently started to build connections with the Food Security Task Force that will hopefully help us build a little bit more integration of the services and really the fabric that they're building and continue to strengthen across the Commonwealth and where childcare fits into that. So there's I think that those ones are particularly paramount, are those social service needs. The trauma needs of children is also particularly profound. And I think this is where, particularly where some of the rubber meets the road in terms of alignment across what school districts might be able to provide in terms of remote instruction and what kind of in-person services are really needed for the children to help navigate, a pretty traumatic experience, and the impact on their not only behavior but on their development. And so we are hearing a lot of that, and that certainly, of course, that's impacting families, and not being allowed to have families in the building and things like that is compounding what is already a pretty traumatic experience. So those are a lot of the service needs. We're hearing a little bit more now around the educational needs of kids at home or around there. I think that much like during emergency childcare and through the summer, as people can settle a little bit more into operations, then they're able to think about some of the more robust educational needs that we know our young children have. But I would say those are some of the themes we're hearing overall.
Okay, thank you.
If I could just add to that, Joni, too, this is Sheila. I think also the youngsters who are in childcare through protective services and referrals from DCF, we're seeing increased need and concern for their well-being.
Yeah.
So the whole social emotional piece of it, as well,
and physical safety.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, and if I can just add, we've as a state, we haven't had the kind of evictions and foreclosures. There's been a moratorium on those, but there's a huge wave of people that are way behind on rent, and if we don't do something long term, those folks are going to become homeless, and that's a huge trauma for children, and a huge disruption oftentimes in their care. And so just something else to be looking out for in the months to come.
Thank you all. I from a community perspective, I'm actually seeing the same things reflected in the population of families and children who aren't in our license programs. So it's not good to know that it's happening, but at least we know what the major issues are to continue to work on. So thank you.
Yeah. And I think that the one other thing I will add to that we hear as much from private pay provider or, providers whose parents are paying privately versus subsidized, we hear across the board is just trying to manage work and safety, and how you make really difficult decisions about where you bring your kids and what your kids need, versus making sure it's safe. And so that, I think, not only is that impacting the families who are showing up in childcare, but it's also impacting the families who are opting not to show up in childcare as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks.
Commissioner, I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit to the challenge that programs are experiencing around finding qualified staff. There's obviously a lot of different components that are feeding that challenge, but some of them run through EEC, and I know you've been really attuned to them. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about, BRC and testing and perhaps childcare needs that staff themselves may have, all of which might be posing barriers in some form.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think, and we'll get a little bit more into some of the workforce data also that we are able to cull from this as we talk a little bit closer about the Educator specifically. But I think we are hearing from the program side of it that it is, it's a tremendous impact on operations. And it's multifold in there. One is finding staff, just finding staff who can come, which is partially the fact that their own childcare or health and safety needs may be taking precedent over their work and returning to work. It may also be that they and so many have stepped out of the workforce entirely because of that, for sure. The other thing we're also seeing in there is potential exposures, and that because sometimes it is let me say it this way. There are times where we are seeing our workforce, because of the fragility of the workforce overall, are in riskier situations, as you see in communities as well. And so I think we're trying to identify some strategies. They may be carpooling, or they may be on public transportation or something along those lines, which is very different exposure levels than some industries. And so I think that also is a huge challenge in terms of the exposures and quarantining. And what that means in terms of operation and staffing. So we have been trying as aggressively as possible to provide as much flexibility in our policies on workforce without undermining the long-term goal. And so that is always the balance in this particular situation, in that when you're trying to recruit workforce, but still maintain standards of professionalization, because the workforce is our investment in our children and families. And so that's the balance, but we're trying to make some what might be intermediate relief that would head towards that would not jeopardize overall. The other thing I will say is that being creative on on staffing patterns and things like that has also been necessary, and understanding where maybe we can provide flexibility where you need 3 teachers, maybe they all don't need the same credential, or we can have some of that, but it is stopping people from opening classrooms and keeping them open. And I think we're also exploring and appreciate the advocacy from the field towards this too, is exploring what kind of access to different health supports the field might need, like testing, that might be able to help keep them open and keep the access to the workforce as a more viable strategy for staying open.
I think at the last meeting, there was some mention of the feds being a little more generous about allowance for childcare centers to offer childcare as a benefit for their own employees. And I think that would be very helpful if in case.
Yeah, at this point, the feds have still been pretty hard and fast on the eligibility threshold for childcare, but I think anyone who fits under there should be absolutely eligible. And so we continue to look into that. And when we look at our data on access to vouchers, we are really trying to figure out how we can make sure that everyone who could be eligible recognizes the pathway they can to get subsidized, so that we can try to provide more resources like that.
Great. Thank you.
All right, so moving on to the next slide. So we wanted to spend some time today talking about educators, and there's 3. If you can go back to the last slide, Christine, if you don't mind. And we wanted to look at sort of 3 components of this, and I'm just going to describe them a little bit globally, so you see the trajectory we're going for here. You have all the materials, so I won't belabor it, but then we can go into explicitly what we wanted to highlight from them. So as you all know, background record checks has been a big overhaul for the department over the last couple of years, the impetus being the CCDBG regulation revisions. But through that, one of the things that we have really recognized and worked with is an improvement in operations that will help us really leverage the investment in technology. And the first step of that was to work on our regulatory framework, prompted by some litigation that that asked us to look closer at specific regulations that we had in place around juvenile delinquencies, that it gave us an opportunity to look at our regulations overall and identify where we might need some more flexibility, or some more clarifications in a way that would allow us to really truly use background record check as a foundation of safety to grow from what we need as a critical investment of the workforce. And so as we've looked at the workforce and educators as a key pillar of our strategic plan, we started to launch into the BRC regulations. We'll go over the updates on those today, but also then wanted to use that as an opportunity to step back, look at what we're learning and what we're seeing from the workforce overall, and then hone in on our theory of action that encompasses the multi-pronged functions that EEC plays on behalf of educators, and can set the path and the framework for helping really build a pipeline of an EEC workforce. So acknowledging that from the background record check that this is a multifaceted type in approach that we'll have to take, and as many of you know from various conversations, that the technology investment is a critical part, the policy and regulation and policy investment is a critical part, but then really focusing on also what that means operationally, so that the delays and the reviews are all happening at the type of rate that will allow us to make sure that we are as responsive to the workforce expediency as programs need for us. This also includes residential and placement providers who are reliant on us to do fingerprinting and background record checks for their workforce as well. And obviously that workforce, as I've gotten to know it, has also continued vulnerabilities, just who they're recruiting and how and the challenge they have with the populations they're serving. And so these regulations really are designed, the regulation proposed here are really designed to help bridge across what is the childcare and the residential and placement processes to build operations from a really solid foundation. So sorry, now we can move on to the next slide and we can go a little bit deeper. I gave a little bit of this background, so I won't spend too much time on it. But we've been under revision, and then you have in there in your packet, the background, the information, what came in public comment, and wanted to end the red line reviews. So if we go to the next slide, I believe we have this. Oh, no, go back to the last one. Sorry, I thought we had one more. So in the appendix, we have an overview of the changes that were made, and we can walk through those for those of you interested. But I'm presuming that you don't need me to read them to you, wanted to ask if there are any questions, and I can dig deeper into ones that you may have specific in
Commissioner, if you had to capture the public comment, how would you capture it in a sentence or two in terms of the reactions?
Yeah, I think that there was well, I will say overwhelmingly a positive nature of people coming back to be able to revisit it. There were a couple of things in here. One is a lot of our flexibility that I think CCDBG offered. We worked back into regulations in some ways. So that was a lot of the public comment was encouraging us to really leverage the flexibility that CCDBG offered. And then the second thing was that I would say that a lot of our public comment was actually advising us on ways that we could revise policy from the regulations. So a lot of the public comment we received didn't make dramatic changes to the regulation, but really will help inform of additional implementation guidance that we'll be using as well.
Got it. That's helpful. Thank you.
So really hone in on a couple of things: juvenile delinquencies being treated differently and set aside. We still reserve the right to be able to elevate any things on a record that happened as a juvenile that we feel are particularly concerning. Obviously, some of the examples I've given on this is it's very different to have a juvenile delinquency that was 40 years ago versus the one that was maybe 9 months ago. And just because of the age of the individual now, we can't look at those the same. And so really giving ourselves the flexibility to do that, but not the regulation to lean one way or the other. The other thing in question that we went over last time was some clarifications on the Families First protocol as well, which governs the funding that many of our residential and placement programs receive from DCF. And so that was the other area where we really honed in on.
Got it. That's helpful.
Mm-hmm.
Any other comments or questions on this?
One more thing to highlight, I'm sorry, Charlie, so that the one other thing to highlight is around the appeals process. And so there is still, that is going to be an operational process that we will put in place. So the regulations lay the foundation, but don't outline the full process because we're still in process of outlining all of it. And so that will be outlined in policy as we solidify that. But that was a priority from the public comment that we wanted to make sure that, that we built into our regulation process.
Well, I know this is, I don't know, again, back to the worlds ago. I know this is a long time coming and I appreciate all of the steps, and there has been a lot of discussion and work on this. I don't know if board members have any other comments or questions. If not, I can make a motion and we can vote, but open it up for another few minutes just in case folks have anything else to add. I remember a long time ago, Mary Walke, do you remember the conversation about the residential piece and all of this, like, right, and the pipeline, et cetera? It just seems like, I'm sure it was a couple of years ago and worlds ago. All right, well, thank you, Commissioner and the team. I will go ahead and make a motion that the Board of Early Education and Care, in accordance with General Law, Chapter 15D, Section 3, hereby approves hereby approves 606 CMR 14, the proposed regulations as amended by review of public comment governing the background record check regulations. In addition, the board also authorizes the Commissioner of the Department of Early Education and Care to file the proposed regulations as amended by review of public comment and subject to review and comment from the Joint Committee on Education with the Secretary of the Commonwealth for publication in the Massachusetts Register as 606 CMR 14 in accordance with General Law, Chapter 30A. Do I have a second? Can I have a second on that?
Second.
Second.
All right, I'm going to go down my screen here. And it's jumping around. I think if you could, oh no, that's fine. That's okay. All right, I'm going to start with Nikki Ruiz de Lizarriaga.
Yes.
Mary Walke.
Yes.
Sheila Balboni.
Yes.
Secretary Pizer.
Yes.
Joan Wasser-Gish.
Yes.
Eleonora Villegas-Reimers.
Yes.
Allison Schoenwald.
Yes.
David Cruz.
Yes.
Carolyn Kane.
Yes.
Joni Block.
Yes.
Great. Approved. Thank you again, Commissioner and team, for this intricate work and process.
Sorry, I put myself on mute so you didn't have to hear me. Absolutely, no, thank you all. And I think this is the, for me, the first, one of the first steps of some good work ahead around background record checks. But I know for the team, midpoint of what is a long, extensive work of around background record checks. So,
and how are we doing on IT for this? How are we doing in terms of the rollout?
Yep. So we have been working on our capital funding, capital approach to the background record check technology. And as you all may remember, I can't remember exactly the time frame, but we took a step back shortly in the new year of 2020 that would look at reorienting our background record check technology from a program-centric so the programs were running background record checks to a person-centric. We have been developing those functional requirements and are well underway of outlining all of the operations for there, and we'll be submitting a next year's capital grant with EOE later this week to be able to continue the work into next year.
Great, that sounds great.
Yeah. So you're going to get a little bit more of an update in a second, but I think that infrastructure part is a key priority for us.
Okay.
So if we can go to the next slide. So wanted to spend some time now really looking at, as you know, we've been looking at our overall strategic plan pillars over the last few months and honing in on the educator pillar this time. So in looking at what we have been articulating as our theory of change, but starting with the where we are putting our energies and our strategies for our initiatives for EEC is really thinking about how we build an educator credentialing framework that would provide, much like QRIS provides a common vernacular of quality across programs, is to talk about a common vernacular around competency around educators, and that really thinking about then how the PD and higher ed pathways really work towards propelling and supporting that growth up that lattice. I think the part that has been really impactful for me over the last couple weeks as we've been talking about this is starting to think about this as if I am an educator, if I am in the workforce, any skills or anything that I take with me from job to job should be in something that comes with me and is not defined by the role that I was in. And so not that I can't have grown in competency in that role, but to truly be able to build the profession, I can't be defined by that role. I have to be able to define by what I as a person am being able to grow and become more competent in, and define that and codify it and validate it by EEC as the system that says, yes, we believe in your growth and we are ensuring that growth happens. So that is really that the actions that we're taking. And then you have what we're really would love to see for educators and where we believe that the measurable positive change will be impacted. So you've seen this slide before, so I won't belabor it, but I think that the way we've been framing it and really thinking about our role as a system to invest in the individual in a way that can transcend any one specific role or one specific type of program. For example, an FCC family child care educator. I have given this in our strategic planning a lot, but I met many educators who would tell me stories during the strategic planning of, I was an FCC provider, but then, I moved and my new house wasn't really good. So I went in to be a teacher, and now, I'm about to have a baby and I would like to go back to doing this. And so how do you really codify what that person has learned along the way in a way that validates that as not having to start over every time, I think is a really important investment for us to make as a field. So moving on to the next slide then. Really thinking, starting with information for us on who is our workforce and what do we mean when we start to think about this, what are we, where is our starting place? You have this information not only from the workforce, but also that is largely from before COVID. Obviously, our information on what's been happening since COVID is very much fluid, and because we don't have one consistent educator registry, we are really piecing together as much information as we can as quickly as possible while we build the infrastructure to be able to get much more real-time data in a meaningful way. And so you see, as Chair Lasso pointed out at the beginning of the meeting, that this workforce is really made up of a vulnerable population in many ways. And I don't say vulnerable always, but particularly in COVID times, when you look at women in the workforce, it's not terminology I would give our workforce as an individual, but I think when you look at who's being impacted by COVID, who's being impacted by work and school changes, and who our workforce is, it adds a lens of vulnerability that I think is important to point out here. And I also think that when you look at what we already knew we had to invest in terms of livable wages, and making sure that we were able to recruit and retain the talent that our children and our families need and deserve, that is there were systemic issues we were addressing and knew we had to address as well. So you have the data here, and I think that these are and some additional data. I think in in some of the things that are in the appendix. But I think what you see here and answering I believe Joan's question around impact on the workforce, that we do see that the closure, and one of the reasons we are aggressively trying to prevent closures from our childcare is not only to address the workforce needs outside of childcare, but also because we know the financial impact is forcing people to further impact their individual employees, and we're trying to mitigate against that as well. And that as we have 82% of programs reopened, we're still seeing significant workforce gaps that we had beforehand.
Commissioner, this is Mary, excuse me. This is probably a difficult number. Do we have any idea what percentage or number of the workforce we have lost from COVID that are not choosing to come back, either for fear of their own health or need to care for their own children? Do we have a number on that or a percentage?
So we don't have, we're looking at from the self-report that programs claim to have kept about 80 to 82% of their workforce extrapolated. So I can't say it's definitively the inverse is true, but it would look like about 20% of our workforce may have been impacted or stepped out of the workforce, and it's a little hard to say the reason for that, but that's probably about as close to approximation as that we can get system-wide.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Other questions on this? Okay.
I was just going to make one quick comment, Commissioner, on the previous slide. The other thing is, like, not only do we want educators with a toolkit that's transferable across settings, and we know a lot these days, certainly 21st century work data suggests lots of role changes and more movement than in decades past at many levels of the workforce and in many sectors. But the other thing is, you want a dynamic system, right? You really want, and in some ways you want to incentivize that. So in other words, put another way, what we don't want is a system that is necessarily unintentionally leaving people in jobs without a sense of easy opportunities to be portable, to change, to grow, right? And so that's the other piece in all of this.
Absolutely. And I think that's really important because what we have seen is people defined by their role, that to then grow and move on means redefining yourself, and then it can be very difficult. Yeah. Trade-off to stay in the field.
Well, and psychologically, it suggests, big change versus this sort of a little bit more of borrowing from behavioral science. Like, I've got this toolkit. We also don't want to think about senior roles as those you just stay in for a very long time and don't move around. You earn lead teacher. We still want to see you do something else and keep moving and growing and changing in the system.
Exactly.
Which makes a stronger system overall.
Yep. And I think if we go 2 slides forward, that some of the data that's suggesting people coming in and out of the workforce suggests that this is exactly the type of thing we want to foster and grow. We have 10,000 new educators that are likely coming into the field, even though we do think we've lost a fair amount. And again, it's really hard to put that number down on here because it's so fluid and so bifurcated. But what we were able to do is pull different indicators of where we're seeing seeing people engage with the tools that we've given already, even the preliminary tools, and seeing that we do have a dynamic field that is looking at and is attractive to people right now. And if we can codify that, if we can hold it, if we can allow for that flexibility and foster it, then I think we can really grow and invest in the kind of professional growth we can that keeps people interested and
retain talent, right? Exactly. That ultimately you want to retain that talent, and that means opportunities.
Yep. So I think this is where we see exactly the kind of data that shows that there's a huge opportunity to do just that, and continues to fuel our momentum in trying to solidify a system that can really help invest in that kind of infrastructure.
Yeah. Competencies for career rather than role.
Mm-hmm. This is Joni. I was just going to say that, Noni, that the emphasis on competencies rather than the licensing title or the piece of paper, I think will really add to the professionalism of the field. And how we do this and aligning it with the QRIS piece with stackable credentials, making assessments of life experiences and really providing the tools for the folks would be really helpful. And as we move forward, really thinking about what is the content of those competencies, so that the skills can be, as you had said, Sam, can be transferable into different settings.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So that we're still growing the field.
Yeah. Yep. I think that's exactly it, and I think that we have such an opportunity. I think, let me say it this way. It feels a little overwhelming that we are trying to sort of move all the pillars at the same time, but I think it is exactly as you said, Joni, the opportunity that is in front of us, because by looking at our licensing regulations, we're able to decouple the educator exactly from the role that they're playing and really think about that, building an aligned system that invests in the educator and allows that to be stackable and reflected in licensing as opposed to codified in licensing. And I think that is really the opportunity we hope to leverage as we move forward, and are working quickly to identify an engagement plan so we can bring the field right into the weeds with us. So I think this is, again, I won't read the data to you, but we did try to cull from here the pieces that we could try to identify in different things that our educators were engaging with that would help indicate where we're seeing new people come into the field. And so you see the EEC Essentials, which is a requirement for new workforce right now. If you are existing, we've alleviated the annual requirement. So we're pretty clear that the EEC Essentials being taken this year are really, should be newer people and represent new people coming into the field. And then we did look at our requirement. We did a short tutorial of good practices in COVID to try to indicate, Mary, of who is coming back into the field. What this doesn't account for is all necessarily administrative staff or volunteers, or there's some other places that we know that is not quite fully expressed here. But I think the other thing to keep in mind here that I just want to highlight, particularly with that last data source with 835 family child care providers having done the first step in becoming licensed, which is the potential provider meeting. This is a pretty documented historical trend in the country, which is as times of unemployment go up, family child care, people interested in providing family child care go up. This is a little bit self-evident in the fact that, like, if I'm not in a job and I have a house, then I use my house for my job, and there is this. I think and there you have it. I think that is a lot of historical trends that show that. The key in front of us right now with this particular moment is that we already knew before COVID that we were losing family childcare at a rate that wasn't going to really continue to sustain the mixed delivery options that our families were relying on. And that with this increase, the question I think we really are honing in on is, what do we need to do to help understand those family childcare providers as both providers, as both programs and educators, so that we can keep them in the field, even if we can't necessarily, even if we are, they may decide to opt into a different type of profession, we don't want to lose them from the field. And so it's really important that we both think about them as licensed programs and gain them into licensed program, but also invest in them as an educator. So depending on where they go next, or hopefully they stay as a family childcare provider for a long time and provide lots of options for families, but that we've attracted them and built and invested in a competency that isn't just a one-time family childcare, but is an investment in a workforce pipeline.
Yeah.
So I think that I just wanted to highlight that while the historical trend bears out, there's an opportunity in front of us to invest differently that I think we really need to hone in on and take advantage of. And in January, we'll be talking more about family childcare specifically, but as educators right now, I think this is, again, looking at how we build a cadre.
It's interesting to think too, Commissioner, about the sort of quote unquote onboarding, right? That, I think what you see in some of the COVID data, FCC's hardest hit, in part because I think it's hard to I think it's challenging to wrap your head around the complexity of mounting the infrastructure, not as a house, but as a childcare center, if you will, right? Even if it is a house. So it's interesting.
Yeah. And I think this is where, the innovation in our strategic plan of trying to look at educators and programs as interdependent and mutually dependent, but also as needing EEC focus so that we respect them as individuals as well.
Yeah.
So moving on to the next slide, I'm happy to field questions and we'll let you all interrupt or raise your hand. I'm trying to keep an eye out, but I also want to make sure that we're getting through some of this so we have lots of time at the end to discuss too. So looking at this, what we then started to look at is taking that to the next level. We know we want to build a credential, and we know we want to make sure that our PD and our higher ed are aligned with that competency-based credential, but now wanting to look at what is our specific role, what are our urgent actions that we need to take in order to be able to drive that investment. So when we look at the EEC role, so one of the things that we know that we need is a robust, easy, user-friendly registry, professional database, because it's very hard to track progress for a workforce over time when we don't have the information to track the individuals over time. So right now, our professional database is really connected much more to me applying to be a lead teacher or a family child care assistant, and much less as me tracking my growth as an individual over time. And so really looking at that professional registry database as a key cornerstone foundation of what we need to build in order for our credential to be able to invest in meaningful growth of individuals as a system. And so we're working on that to try to ensure that it's user-friendly, that it aligns with our background record check technology that we're underway in building, that aligns closely with the licensing technology so that we don't have, you shouldn't be defined by your role, but we certainly don't want to have barriers for you to be able to be assigned to your role in that program. And so really building it together, but making sure again that professional registry allows us to track an individual's history and growth and not just the program that they're in. And so that I think is a key component, a key infrastructure that then will help us operationalize the second component that we're in the process of building, which is really looking for a standardized set of expectations. What do we mean about a credential that pushes the envelope on how we recruit and sustain workforce? And I think one of the key things in here that we've been focusing on is how do we make it simple enough that people don't spend most of their time trying to figure out where they fit and what their next step is, and actually spend most of their time taking the next step, taking the course, figuring out how there's nothing worse than thinking you've done everything right and then submitting it to a bureaucracy and finding out you had 17 more steps to do or you took the wrong one. And I can say from moving here, that was my experience with lots of utilities, and certainly want to make sure that we're building something that that really can be simple for people to measure and document their growth. And then making sure that all fits with licensing requirements. And so really building a credential and building the infrastructure for that credential in a way that that is cleanly aligned and doesn't pit educators and their licensed program into clash. And so thinking about ways that we develop the credential expectations for roles as opposed to specific professional qualifications, so that a person can track their own qualifications and again, not assigned to the role, just knowing, and I'm making this up, but I'm a level 3 and the role requires a level 3, as opposed to trying to check all of the details in there. And so really simplifying our licensing and aligning it with a simplified educator profile is how we hope that EEC's roles can be best leveraged on this. But then knowing that it is great to invest in a system that EEC can foster in terms of the equivalency of a teacher licensure, a credential that allows for professional standards and professional growth and trajectory across programs. But it is only as effective as our professional development and higher ed resources are able to help people really get the tools and resources to be able to climb the ladder and climb that work. And so really thinking about building that professional credential that is not, that allows a way to respect and codify the benefit that work experience does provide to an individual, but also being able to provide those types of resources around honing specific skills that people need to be able to go and apply that to their work experience. And so being able to understand the two components of EEC's role in designing the system, but also working with partners to be able to align resources to the system that really can help codify and propel people into a professional trajectory. So this is where we've honed in our roles. Let me pause here for a second and the next couple of slides just go a little bit more into specific strategies. So if you all, I can go further, or if there are questions here first.
What's your time frame on the registry? What kind of time frames are we talking about here?
Yeah, so we are looking to hopefully be able to have a registry that would, I so hesitate to say timeframes out loud, but I will say, let me say it this way. We will have a significant progress on the registry this fiscal year. We have some significant infrastructure laid. Yeah, okay. Whether it's fully operationalized by June is a question, but it will be substantively completed.
That's great. Thanks.
Yeah.
I just had a question about the differentiation between roles in professional development and wanting to support our teachers in developing the skills and knowledge they need. But I would hope that doesn't preclude the learning that could go on in the work environment, because that's so effective there,
Absolutely. And I think, Sheila, this is one of my big hopes for how we even can support providers from being professional development providers as much as they are employers, right? And so you see here, one of the things that you have is build an accreditation system to validate training professional development, that if I am doing the kind of robust data-informed routines of collaboration that happen at a program level in a center-based program, for example, that I could submit that trajectory and that routine as a way to have that count not only for my own employees' edification and improved practice, but that should that employee move from Boston to Worcester to Lawrence to Springfield, they're taking that with them in their credential. And obviously that is, I don't want, I think as I said in my interview, I don't want to make it sound like that's easy. That is unicorn land. But I do think that that by holding that is a value, and that one of the things we want to do is have the investment that programs are making in their employees be meaningful in that person's career, not just in that person's job, is one of the visions I think that we are continuing to plod towards.
And of course, a direct benefit on the quality of the experiences for children. So.
Absolutely. Absolutely. All of it. I mean, I think, yes, for saying that, I do feel like it is warrants saying, like, to me, and I say this a lot in presentations, like there's, we are a human service. Education is a human service as well. Like we invest, the quality of what we deliver is only as good as the humans that are delivering it. And so part of why this is so important is being able to make sure that the humans that are responsible for the delivery of our services and with the care and education of our children have the resources that they need to be successful too. With the idea that there are 80,000 people out there, and so creating some sort of system so that we can both honor the individual experience, but also funnel it into what is codified and respected as a profession is the challenge ahead.
Thank you so much for bringing this forward and for keeping this critically important work going, even as so much else has been happening. I agree that the opportunity here and the potential for better alignment with licensing and QRIS and sort of having this broader vision for progress is so key. But I'm wondering if you can kind of break it down, because there are pieces like Sheila referenced the job embedded professional development. There are other components like having individualized plans to help people be planful and intentional about their professional growth that aren't quite showing up here. So I'm wondering if Commissioner, you could just start with the example of, I'm a classroom teacher, I'm working in a program. What happens? What should I expect?
Yep. So then if we move on to the next slide, I believe it is, it'll be a little easier to talk through that. Let me talk through these 4 strategies of support a little bit, and then I'll talk through at a high level of these, which I already addressed somewhat, and then Joan walk through it as if I was a person coming into our system and what these would mean. So our strategies are really, I think, centered on the functions that are required in order to streamline that educator, the example that Joan just said, to streamline their experience, right? There's functions that just to be and stay in the classroom, EEC needs to perform and support you in the classroom and a family child care, to be an educator in our field and be working in a licensed program. One is you have to have a suitable background record check, and that can't be out of sync of your credential, because then we're sending mixed messages. You have all the skill set you need, but not the qualifying background, right? Or vice versa. So how do we kind of make that unified so it becomes part of your credential, part of your registry record that then allows you to know whether you're applicable to the job or not. So that's the first thing that we're really focused on. And as I said, when we were talking about the regulations, a lot of that is operations more than policy. A lot of that is making sure that we're turning around things quickly, that we're communicating effectively, that licensors have a tab on who's where, so that if there is any stumbling block, we're all following that. So that's a huge strategy for us beyond the regulations, is really codifying the operations of background record check. Then building the registry, as I said, so that there is one place, and I'm not trying to take my credential from over here, my transcript from over here, my background record check from over here, and put it all together and try to go to my employer and say, look, I'm fine, you can hire me, right? How do we bring that into a single record from EEC so that all of our functions that you're relying upon us are in one place, that then say, okay, me, Sam Eigner-Treewergy, number 11653, fit at this level, and you can hire me, and you don't need to pick all the pieces up. And so to streamline and make it easier for someone to follow their own career. Doesn't mean you have to stay in the field, doesn't mean you have to stay in our licensed programs, but it's something that is transferable across what would be requirements for us, and a lens that employers and educators could all use to try to make sure that we were speaking the same language and that there was consistency. Then making sure that part of that record includes a competency measure. so that I may have a great suitability background and I may have a BA, but also being able to show that that BA measures up to a level 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or whatever level we say in a credential, which is far from developed yet, but you get that. That this question of how do we have part of your record be a validation of your competency as well. That EEC provides the way, sort of thinking the way DESE provides teacher licensure, says, yes, you are codified to go and perform this profession. What role do we play in creating a similar system? And then making sure that everything that you have around there, so anything, as Sheila points out, if I am a great program that offers amazing professional development, how does that get captured on my registry record too? So if I do take a next job, that goes with me and can be part of my credential elevation. So if you think about it from the individual's level of what I might be engaging in, to be able to go in and sign up to be an EEC educator through a registry, be able to apply for my background record check and make sure that I have a suitable background and have that be on my registry record, be able to apply for a credential evaluation to say, I think I'm a level 3 in my credential, and so I'm going to ask them to codify that, and then to be able to take my record and look for jobs that say requirement level 3 on the credential, right? And so instead of saying it's a BA with all of these different things, we've been able to sort of solidify around some common vernacular of what requirements of different roles might be, in a way that we can then think about that me as the individual don't have to try to piece together, do I have the right coursework? Do I have the right, did I get the right suitability? Did I apply as a licensee on my background record check as opposed to an employee, or how, like all of those things, have that solidified in a way that I can then take the kind of validation that you might have if you were an RN, a nurse, right? And there's different levels there. You have kind of a common vernacular that allows me to identify and stay in roles in a cleaner way that's transferable across EEC programs. So I don't know, Joan, if that last example really helped elucidate exactly what you were getting at, but I think that is the hope, is that we are streamlining it and disaggregating the educator's experience with EEC from the program's experience, so the educator can facilitate that the system helps an educator facilitate their own growth and development and professional trajectory as well.
Tim, this is Nikki. I was wondering if you could just go a step further and just clarify the role that higher ed is playing. So these kind of stackable credentials, yeah, will they add up to like an associate's degree, a bachelor's degree that would be recognized outside of the EEC system as well?
Yep. So I think that this is something we're grappling with head on, Nikki, right now in terms of how we're looking at designing and thinking about a credential. And I don't want to make us sound like we're unique. This is an age-old question in education, right? Is the access to higher ed as a validation point of competency, knowing that there's all sorts of equity issues in accessing higher ed that are inherent in all of our systems that are barriers, particularly for the workforce that EEC represents. And so really thinking through where the role for credit-bearing coursework that articulates into a degree, and where and how can we look at competency measures based on work experience or based on specific types of activities, and where is the equivalency and where is the buildup? I think these are all really, Nikki, like head on the questions that we are trying not only to grapple with in our own system, but also really engage with our partners in meaningful ways, including higher ed, in ways that help us figure out what kind of innovation we might be testing here. And to be clear, this is where K-12 and Secretary Pizer might have more understanding of what's actually grappled with in Massachusetts on this. I know more of the national lens, but I know states across the country have been grappling from a K-12 lens of many of those teacher certifications have validated competency through, a proficiency test or, a degree-based approach. And I know most states have been trying to think, how do you measure how do you provide multiple measures of competency in there? And it's a difficult issue that I think we're hoping to try to present some innovations on that would help us push the envelope a little bit.
Oh, Commissioner, I was just throw in a comment. We've had for a long time in Massachusetts alternative pathways to certification that are based on more on sort of practice and competencies. It's been used very little, in part because it's complicated to do. It requires a lot of local capacity in order to sort of set up not only the evaluation, but the system by which it operates. And it's sort of easier to go through the traditional paths, quite frankly. But nonetheless, we have set some things up. It may be worth looking at them to see if there's some lessons learned there.
Yeah, that's great. Both helpful and also proving the point that it's difficult.
Yeah, it just seems to me that if we could create something that was recognized, it just would be a great pathway for folks who are living with low incomes and don't really have access to higher ed to sort of work and build their sort of record of higher education at the same time and do it in a way that was really, it aligned well with everything that they were doing.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is a bigger systems alignment question, so I don't want to even, intend to conjecture that there's like a solution that I have in the back pocket, but I do think that this is one of the areas that I think is a potential for innovation on this, of looking at how EEC's validation could really help translate people's experience to their pathway into higher education, and certainly something that we're interested. I think we see that as a conversation to be had down the road once we're able to even sort of articulate for us exactly what EEC's system could look like. Then we can start to say how, in alignment with everyone, co-create what CEC's system could look like. I think keeping in mind how it could be used that way. And I think the specifics will start to play out once we have more of the framework codified.
So, Commissioner, this is John.
I'm just mindful of the time, Commissioner. Just thinking about the last agenda item. I'm just flagging that.
Yep. Yeah, maybe about 5 more minutes.
Joni, maybe if you have just a brief question or comment that we could return to down the line.
We can wait for it. It's more of a bigger question in terms of the challenges and strengths we have currently in the department to continue and work on this, as well as the opportunities we see. And this isn't a question at this point, the opportunities on looking at the birth through 3 piece and the expertise that we have in our sister agencies as well, and looking at how to fill up those the content of those competencies. But this will be an ongoing conversation. I just want to bring up, let us think about what are our strengths that we have right now that we can build on, and what might be the needs or challenges that we need to consider in the future.
Yep. Let's flag that for early new year as part of this ongoing conversation about the strategic plan and the educators piece.
Mm-hmm. And I will say, the one sentence on that is, this is why the system is the 4th pillar in the strategic plan, is that we recognize the infrastructure, the organization, the intentionality of the connections between units and the EEC and between departments that will really make this successful on the ground. So do you want to move on to the next slide? I'll just touch quickly. I said most of these things, so you see that this is a different representation, but again, looking through those 4 areas where we have been investing as seeing a need for a comprehensive integration of these functions and thoughtfulness, not to say they wouldn't be integrated with every other pillar, but really thinking in a depth of initiatives and strategies of how these things need to fit together. And then you have a quick status update on there of where we are. To be clear, I just wanted to highlight that these status are internal thinking, and we've, obviously the background record check is a little farther along on the policy, the regulations, and then we're working on policies and protocols next. But we are, as I mentioned, I want to just reiterate that none of these are being done in a back room. We are setting the stage for what will be a robust engagement on these conversations in the way that we have did in the strategic plan. So this is not a head back and eventually you'll see a final product. It is trying to get ourselves in a way of all of these that we can really launch into thoughtful engagement with the field, starting with some of the closest stakeholders, like in career pathways, looking at higher ed, but also being thoughtful about where other players would have good perspectives there. So that's what you have here. I believe that if we move on to the next slide, we'll move on to the next agenda item. So I'm going to move on, but again, as Chair Lasso said, happy to regroup on any of this as we go back. I want to make sure we have time for some of the budget and spending update. Excellent. Okay. So as you all may have known, we have been seeing, so the FY21 budget, which we'll outline in a second, did come out of the conference committee on Friday, and so now is in the process of looking at through the governor's process, and then we'll start being able to operationalize based on that. So we are actively planning and thoughtful around what that would look like, because obviously the urgency in the field is it demands from us an urgency in being able to operationalize as soon as the decisions are made. The final decisions are made. So we continue to look deeply at our caseload numbers. You have all of those in the appendix, and they follow a similar format than as they did last time that we were talking around looking at disaggregating our caseload numbers in a way that looks at the avenues people have to get into subsidy, and trying to understand where the barriers are and how we look to stakeholders like the CCR&Rs to help us make sure we're facilitating parent access. Given that we've pushed our policies, we know that those policies are only as effective as they're being leveraged by our partners on the ground. So you see, we still do have a declining enrollment, and mostly what we see in that declining enrollment is there are the two areas are DTA. We have been working with Commissioner Kershaw. I've been working with Commissioner Kershaw just to highlight that we are seeing this. They're not as big as the income eligible vouchers, but at this point, and not to say that this couldn't change tomorrow, the declines haven't been indicated from their end as there being any sort of barrier to entry for DTA, so much as the overall challenges in the field around just accessing assistance and the reality of the communities right now. The income eligible vouchers with the CCR&Rs support enrollment in those. We are seeing pretty big, we are still seeing declines in those, and that does seem to be our biggest declines. And so we have been working closely with the CCR&Rs to track what kind of activities they're seeing as effective in recruiting. While the declines in enrollment, as you see, allowed us, our expenditure rates have allowed us to pay our parent fees without worry of overspending beyond our appropriation at this point, and also consider what kind of investments we could make in operations outside of it. We obviously, the challenge with our caseload account is it's very difficult to pay providers outside of enrollment given the federal regulations. But if we are paying providers and we're investing in operations, there's other ways that we can do some of that and charge differently to the feds. And so we are looking in all of those avenues given that as well. So what we are doing on this is we are going to look at trying to open up our contracts much more than we had. I mean, I think it's sort of, we don't know that opening up our contracts, looking at where our contracted enrollment is and has been steady at, is going to have a huge impact on enrollment overall. But we do anticipate that those providers who have contracted and voucher enrollment may make some shifts that would help us hone in on what the challenges are in voucher access, and start to think very critically about what we can do with in partnership with the CCR&Rs to try to expand and think about access differently in that component. So that is, I think, what we were hoping by looking across all of these data, is to try to identify where we would be able to maximize EEC efforts into some strategies to try to overcome, as opposed to try to, tackle all strategies at once and having diminishing returns on our efforts. So you have that. I also wanted to highlight here that the CCDBG spending update, you have the outline there that tells you exactly where we have been for the expenditures on CARES Act. As you remember, it went out as classroom or program-based grants, reopening grants for July and August. So we're in the final stages of reconciling. There was some discrepancy on how many classrooms opened versus what date we opened. And so final payments will go out this weekend, and you have the data there. What you do see is that we cost estimated all of it at maximum utilization, and we did not have all of our providers open up, and we did not have all of our providers take advantage of the full grant or the full classrooms. So given the underspending there, we are able to put that towards the total cost of our parent fees for the year, and help defray the overall impact of absorbing that expense on our overall caseload account. And so that's what it will be used for. It's within the line item language, which allows us to spend it on subsidized programs and an expense that we know was a priority for them too, that this was allowable. So given that, moving on to the next slide on FY21, I'll wrap up FY21 and then happy to talk more on that part. So as I mentioned, the conference report did come out on Friday, and it did represent a 25% increase to EEC's general appropriation from last year. So we wanted to highlight where some of those biggest questions are. It does hold our quality improvement, our quality investment constant, so we will continue to be able to invest in the trajectory forward for our program quality, as well as try to maximize some of that to replace that is where the UPK grant came from too. So really being able to think about the most strategic investment of some of the funds that we're seeing, that I know people were hoping to have dispersed as soon as we had a budget. It also has $40 million for the parent fee reserve. It does continue to, the outside sections you see at the bottom there do continue to allow us to keep on our trajectory for the parent fee schedule and revisions that we've been discussing. The $40 million will cover a big investment we'll talk about in a second on the parent fee question. As I pointed out in the last slide, the overall expected cost of the parent fee this year is $72 million. So we're still looking, that will cover part of it, but the line item language does continue to have us pay our parent fees through the end of the fiscal year. So we do anticipate the total cost of that will be closer to $70 million. Obviously, with fluctuating enrollment, the cost of that is a little bit unknown right now, but we do anticipate that it will be closer to last year's amount. The other notable thing on this that's worth pointing out is the $25 million reserve for corona-related supports. One key thing is that the line item language does target that to subsidize providers, and so there is still a limited footprint of what we would be able to open that money up for, but it does provide the flexibility for us to be able to invest in the ways we know programs really needed, not attached to an individual child, but attached to the operational supports that is really not only supporting them keeping their doors open, but as I mentioned, keeping the workforce, which is vital for the operations.
Commissioner, can I ask a clarifying question in all of this? I suspect I knew this at one time. If a program has a closure because of an exposure, is there a subsidy or anything in that fund, in that CARES, from that CARES money to help them out with the...
We haven't yet designed the program that corona-related support would go towards. For us right now, if they receive any subsidized, if they enroll any subsidized children, we will continue to pay for that subsidy through the closure, whether the child can attend or not, as well as backup care for that child.
And I must say, if I could just add, that's a life-saving, I mean, that's been such a wonderful benefit for the field. So great question and great answer. Thank you.
But I think, I think that we need to do more because that is a subset. We know it's not enough. We know all of that. And so this kind of flexibility allows us to, take what we're doing and think about what other impact could and should we be having to help mitigate the impact of those closures when people are making the right health choice.
I was thinking about it too, and I'm just flagging this for the board in the context, we've had the push from the field and we ourselves share the view around the testing. The more you test, the more cases you find, the more closures you're going to have. They could be asymptomatic, it never would have been detected. So it got me thinking about, on the other side, just how we might implement with an ethical lens that way too.
Yeah.
Part of what's so important about what you're flagging, Noni, I think, is the fact that we're trying to be a little bit proactive and sort of anticipate some of the challenges that might be forthcoming. And I think along those lines, when we look at enrollment numbers, when we know that more of the caseload is currently around school age and that we have a lot of suppressed demand for all of the reasons that we've been talking about, as we look to the months ahead, particularly where schools are anticipated to open for more in-person learning, that has the potential to be really destabilizing for the EEC field. And we know that families are going to need, particularly after school care or, care on days when children are not enrolled in a hybrid model, if there's more in-person learning. And so, I think part of what we need to be thinking about is, how can we be proactive and strategic in trying to mitigate the impacts that we can see coming, whether it's relative to closures or relative to more activity with schools being open in person, the ways in which our age groups are splitting. We need to think about how to keep as much sustained as possible over the next number of months. Things will get better, but we've got a rocky road between now and then.
Yep. And I think one of the things in that, there are other investments that aren't represented here. I think what we've tried to highlight here are the things that push the innovation the most. I think that, there's the rate reserve, but what that does is continue to attach dollars per child. And we know that that's a struggle. So really trying to figure out how we do things differently. I think there's a really important thing to put in here on this is that the corona-related supports for the education workforce also allows us to be able to pull any of the caseload account funding that may not be spent and be able to pull it towards this more flexible operational spending. And as you said, Joan, I think that that is going to be critical. What we know right now is programs are being really, really impacted by a per dollar, a per child funding structure. And so being able to pull as much funding as possible into a process that will allow us to address the operational concerns without having to worry about enrollment is, I think, where our priority is, to help really be as flexible and responsive as possible, given the tumultuous landscape we know everyone is enduring right now at the community level, and so many different players making so many different decisions with so many different changing factors every day. So I think, again, there's a lot of stuff that is not outlined here, but some of the most innovative things that we know that we wanted to highlight as the ability to address the board's most pressing and prioritized concerns for the field are the things we wanted to highlight.
Yeah.
So
as you know, Commissioner, when I walked away from our February retreat, the day-long meeting, I walked away feeling like funding at the unit level, call it classroom, call it compositional, however you want to think about it, is in many ways the first step to unlocking all of this quality improvement work. So I think, to the extent that others agree, we've got to start scoping that space. It seems to me there's no getting around that as the cornerstone to all of the other kinds of innovations and quality improvement work that you have been so carefully thinking about. That so long as we're funding these slots, and the slots are kind of moving around, and we have a system organized around the individual child, we're missing a systems level approach, right? I mean, we just are.
And that's the hard part. And I think that we know that the rates and I've been talking a lot with my co-administrator on this. We know rates are very low. We know that chasing after market rate is a really hard construct nationally in terms of a subsidy process. And so when you talk to the administrators, like the struggle of trying to chase after a market rate, that every change in investment you make in subsidy is responsive to something that is fluctuating far faster than government can work, is a real challenge for the way that the system is set up. And I think that not discounting the fact that, as Sheila pointed out, that trying to survive on subsidies alone as a provider takes all the flexibility we can give and then some right now. But understanding that there's if we are only focused on trying to chase after the market rate, it will become a very difficult proposition right now, given where families are overall in the Commonwealth. So moving on to the next slide, I wanted to take that conversation. Happy to keep having conversations about FY21, but wanted to make sure and may just kind of highlight this at a high level, and then go into wrap some of this up into some of the parent fee question too, because I don't want to speed through that too much. So Governor, now that FY21 is underway and moving towards what we need next, the governor's will work on the governor's office is working on the FY22 budget with ANF, and really wanting to inform that and wanting to have some conversation now around where priorities. I think this conversation really did start to lead to that, so I don't need to backtrack and want to transition to, are there other things to talk about in terms of FY22 priorities in a way that we can ensure that we're leveraging the board's process of making a recommendation, given the timing we're at in the FY21-22 process that seems to be converging on each other right here.
Anybody?
I'm always interested in really thinking about part of the professional development and support that we provide for quality initiatives, to be sure that we address the the needs of individual children, whether we're talking about children with disabilities, dual language learners, the social emotional piece, but really to assure that those pieces get significantly addressed and support inclusive learning environments that the field is really grappling with.
Commissioner.
Yeah, I mean, I think we definitely will do that. I was wondering if there are any other comments beyond that before we move on, but I think absolutely, I think we can definitely reflect that. I think there is a, as we think about that, thinking about the financing strategy as a stabilizer too, so that those supports can really build and not compensate for what couldn't be provided, I think is something we're trying to think about, the full integration of support so that there is no wrong door, and we're trying to make sure that they're all available as well.
I want to build on what Joni raised, because so much of the conversation over the last year, for really understandable reasons, has been around program stability and access to childcare so that people can work and so that we can rejuvenate the economy. But we really cannot take our eye off how critical program quality is, and to think about financing as one piece of that puzzle. But I think we've often been hesitant to take full measure of what we know is required to deliver quality. And I think particularly, as Commissioner, you raised the fact that we know that many kids are experiencing trauma coming into programs with more intensive needs. They may not have had opportunities for enriched learning experiences as much over the last year or 18 months as things begin to open up. And so the work that will go on in early education and care programs at every age level is going to require more. And so I think our job is to think about how to best support people doing the real work to be successful with the children and families that they're serving. And while we talk in numbers, it's ultimately how do we build the components of quality so that those can be delivered. And so I think that needs to be the emphasis here, with an eye not only on program stability and quality, but also on a broad set of comprehensive services and supports that we leverage both within the program, but also to children and families.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think in terms of the staging and sequencing, I think that we're trying to understand in terms of investment too, would be helpful to hear around from the board, I think in terms of how we think about what needs to be in place in order for the system to grow, I think is a question. I think when we think of the immediacy that FY22 is coming up with, that question feels particularly pertinent.
Just going to recast that, Commissioner. You mean a question for the board about priorities in this space of stabilizing or outside of that space?
Sorry,
what's your question for the board?
My question, I think what Joan's response was, or Joan's comment was, that we need to think about the funding that is needed, or sorry, that the services that are needed to be provided through childcare, but also the comprehensive services that would be needed around. And I guess as we think about the urgency, in order for investments to be best spent on those comprehensive services, one of the questions I'd have is sort of what are some of the priorities up front, knowing that, you know, families need far more than we're going to be able to fully build in a year. How would we be thinking about prioritizing some of that?
Yeah, and maybe in some respects it's a matter of a little bit of a landscape analysis in terms of what you all are thinking about as an agency, what you're seeing in terms of services outside of just the financing, and we could have a discussion in that regard. Mm-hmm. Rather than start
Absolutely.
our
Do that here. Absolutely. And I think this is not necessarily a conversation, to your point. It is not necessarily a conversation for right this second, but to be thinking about that as we engage over the next 4 weeks or whatever, however long until the January board meeting, so that what we come back with you reflects some of the prioritization that you all think about as well.
Sounds great. So maybe the thing to do is spend a few minutes on the highlights and the changes from last month on this parent fee issue. And then it seems to me we may need an hour before the next board meeting on a focused discussion about this parent's fee space. I also personally would like to talk more with GBLS about this letter and just get more clarity on how they're thinking about this also.
Absolutely. So I want to, if we go on to the next slide and look at the parent fees quickly, I think there's an opportunity at the end of this conversation to also merge some of these. I know Nikki wanted to say something, so to say I think that there's an opportunity after this to merge some of these conversations. Because I think I just want to make sure that we get an overview, and then I think we can open up for more questions. So as you know, I'm going to frame it up, and then I think Jocelyn's here can talk through a little bit more of the models that we're talking about, but recapping where we were last year, last month, feels like last year, where we were last month, of being able to show you the principles of the models that existed. So all of our models do hold to some basic principles you have here, and also look at a couple different constructs. Initially, as you know, Urban Institute worked with us to respond to the Greater Boston Legal Services 7% across the board model, as you know, through conversations last month, and talking through some of the implications of that. That one of the implications is the transition from our very small percentage of subsidized families that we support to incoming off of the subsidy, and the impact of that was one big concern of that. And so as we looked at it, developed other models that would help mitigate some of that, and that's what you have here. The framing for this that you know is to really think about the graduated approach that would help a family, help the copay be reasonable, but help us think about the transition off of subsidy as well. And so the models that we have range in the percentages you have of where you enter into paying a copay as you move beyond 100% federal poverty level, to where you exit out of subsidy at a percentage level. So you have these three models, and we provided for model 2 and 3, we provided the Excel sheet so you can see the implications and the details of those models as well. So we wanted to hone in on the model 2 and 3 today as options of where we can get some feedback from you as we look to put forth a full funding model, full parent fee model for approval in January. So I'm going to give it to Jocelyn to talk through these two models. To be clear on this is a combination of best policy practices that we were looking to implement, as well as understanding what a potential revenue impact could be. And so wanted to make sure, as we can move on to the next slide, make sure that you had the details here. So Jocelyn, I think we just have like maybe 1 minute. I think everyone's read this. So if you want to just highlight a couple of things in the cost of families portion.
Yeah, and just I think clarifying one thing, it's model 2 and 4. The models actually aren't in the order you do expect them to. The most expensive one is 3, or the most expensive one for families is 3. So we focus in on 2 and 4. You have the potential fee charts for models 2 and 4 and the full results for all 4 models in the information that I sent. Happy to dig into any details, but in thinking about this, we looked at cost to families, and we just pulled out a few metrics that we could compare across models to try to get a sort of a sense of a benchmark around how holistically the models would affect families from, how many families would pay a lower fee, which is the majority in all cases. How many would pay a fee that is either 7% or less, sort of thinking about one way of looking at that benchmark. One thing that we did notice that if you're a single parent with 2 children, the fees tend to be slightly higher for that group because of the nature of the family structure and where it falls in family size. So we did pull those pieces of information out as just something to pay attention to. And we wanted to understand what the average fee is across the model as well for families, also thinking about that benchmarking. You can see the expected revenue. This is in comparison to the 72 million that we currently estimate we get from families. Again, these are models, these are predictions. These aren't precise predictions of exactly what would happen because the caseload is constantly changing as well. I just feel like I need to call that out. And then thinking about, trying to understand the impact that would have on the EEC side, one way to think about is just translate this into, sort of the difference in current parent fee revenue with the parent fee revenue we expect from these models in terms of, sort of the additional cases that amount of money could cover. So you see at the bottom, Model 2 and Model 4 mapped out in that way. But I'm happy to answer questions. I mean, I know you all have the details, and I'm happy to answer questions that people have.
Yeah, and I just want to highlight one additional thing, and then we can open it up and answer any additional questions or thoughts as you all go forward and answer. You have the timeline in the next slide, so we can talk through what might happen before January. But I know the question came of like, what would this roughly translate to in terms of number of cases? But I want to make the clear point that with the investment from the legislature or in the legislative budget that was passed of the 40 million towards this, it would mitigate some of these costs should that be folded into our ongoing caseload. So I just wanted to make the point that that would that is a lens here, and that by determining what fee scale that we might look at next year, that will also determine the need and the ability for us to meet that. So I just want to clear that it is not a one-for-one translation, nor is it that some of this could not be mitigated in operations, in operationalizing. So, but I know that question came up, so I wanted to be responsive.
It seems like one sticking point in general is going to be this sort of 7%, and how do you all think about this benchmarking, or it's not a benchmark? Right? I mean, it's kind of cast both ways.
So I think that the answer is that you see our case.
Kind of like the market rate survey. Like, is it the same kind of problem?
It's a little bit different here. I think that the issue is that caseload numbers are constantly evolving. So being able to estimate an impact on numbers of children served is not as clean as saying you take $1 out and a family is impacted. I think that some of the nuances that families roll in and out of childcare throughout, so it's not as clean as that, as well as this is based on an average cost per child, but having an infant toddler versus school age is a very different number. So it's really hard to estimate some of that. But I think fundamentally understanding where some of the board's priorities in terms of how we think about parent fee implementation is helpful, because you understanding our parent fee model and the increased cost per child that EEC will be taking on will help us do improved cost modeling. And that will help us be able to refine and understand where policy can help mitigate the impact on overall caseload, or even what the caseload impact, revenue impact might be, in a way that would help us be more articulate about that in a budget process.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. Thank you.
This is hard stuff, so.
Yeah, no, I hear you.
It is. I really appreciate how you framed the question, and I think that you're exactly right. Like there's definitely not a one-for-one here. It will vary on so many different criteria, including, what proportion of our caseload becomes DTA as we go through an economic recovery, right? That will speak to this. How does this impact our ability, if any, to begin to concentrate more resources and programs in order to help stabilize them? What does it mean in terms of caseload? I think at the end of the day, the impacts will depend very much on what ends up in the FY22 budget. So no one said it yet, but the FY21 budget is actually quite good. So thank you to everyone who played an important role in making that possible. But we are rolling right into the FY22, and whether or not the legislature's investment in parent fees is renewed will have potentially a very significant impact. So we just want to be mindful of that, even if we can't quantify it entirely. And I think for me, the thing that I wanted us to keep our eye on most closely is, what does access under the IE line item look like? And I want to keep an eye on that, because there are many, many different sources of pressure on the caseload account and on IE in particular. This has the potential to contribute to that pressure or not, depending on how things go. But at the end of the day, I think watching access under IE to ensure that families who are not able to come in under any other gateway, but who are eligible, continue to have eligibility. And that we don't want to restrict that too much, with this as one potential source of that impact. So at the end of the day, that's where I want to keep our eyes.
So in that sense, you know, I think part of this too is to figure out how to build it into the overall, into the macro modeling for the agency, right? Commissioner, like, rather than, yes, I hear you, Joan, entirely, like, this will, legislature, yes, to this year, this will matter greatly in FY22. The question is, how do we absorb this over time in a different kind of way of thinking about the costs, period, right? Yeah. During this transition period, we need support and hits to the budget so that we can absorb it. But over time, right, as we look at cost of quality and modeling out what does it cost to build this system in Massachusetts, this has to be part of it.
Yeah, and I do actually think that this helps understand board priorities in relation to FY22 budget recommendations as well, and understanding how we engage on that, because the idea, I think, to Joan's point, is the overall impact we have to balance the overall impact on programs and the overall impact on families as well. And one of the things that positions this conversation squarely in that is the reliance on subsidies only as a financing mechanism. And therefore, it does hit this question of parents and providers, and how do providers have access to funding, and how do families have access to tuition supports become part and parcel of the same conversation. But one of the things I think that I heard you guys say in the last conversation, and has been part of our strategic plan conversation, is how do we understand that those two don't by default have to be the exact same tension around the same, where parent fees feels like you're taking one out of one pocket to put into another, as opposed to trying to think creatively about strategies that could mitigate that as a false choice, and start to think differently without taking it out on parents simultaneously, right? And so not taking it out, but without impacting and having a negative impact on parents by default there. And so I think that one of the questions as we look forward and hearing what kind of, I'm going to try to conjecture so you guys can push back or say something, but one of the challenges I hear you articulating that we have to grapple with is this question about a family-friendly model and how we look at appropriate affordability benchmarks, coupled with a recommendation that that addresses the complexity of that decision, given the current model, and where we would want to see innovation to help decouple some of that. Again, you can push back on that, but I hear you saying that that would be that would help mitigate the tough decisions confronted here.
I would say, to support Joan's point, historically, whenever times get tough, it's generally i.e. that group of working poor that take it on the chin and that, lose their childcare. So it's always very sad to see that group deprived of the kind of support important to them.
The other question that I was thinking about, and again, I think we can push this off and maybe you and I can talk offline at some point, or whomever is interested. I think there's this other question that I had, which is there kind of a staged approach here that tracks with getting towards like funding classrooms and a different, as you think about the implementation of the strategic plan and where you want to get to with your vision, Commissioner, and what that means for the way we think about the funding model, the cost of quality, does that also mean that there's a reason to think about this parent fee work sort of now and a few years out where it might fit? That was the only other question that I've had in the back of my mind.
Yeah, well, I will say one thing that was a fundamental principle that we didn't outline specifically in doing this was the ability that this had to be able to be responsive over time. So there has to be a simple nature to it in some ways too, simplified enough, given the fact that we're watching such dramatic changes in the landscape, and hopefully we'll be able to continue to see Massachusetts be an innovative leader in how we address some of the challenges confronted in this industry. This shouldn't become outdated immediately, accordingly.
Yeah, right.
Part of what I think is implicit is whether or not we can ultimately build this contribution into our maintenance of effort request, because I don't know how else it becomes baked into the system. And I know that can be delicate and it raises a lot of questions, but I think it's something that as we look at FY22, we need to begin to develop a strategy around.
All right. Well, I know our time is up. Any last comments or question to at least surface before we adjourn around these parent fees, and we can think about what's needed to be ready for a January vote? Anybody want to flag any questions or comments they have? You can also take another look at the materials over the course of the next week or so as well.
Yeah, I will say we will be codifying some of what we heard today into some engagement around budget priorities over the next month. So at the next meeting, we can be prepared to have the board solidify and move forward budget priorities in time with the FY22 consideration as well.
Yeah, and
so please do reach out if there's something that comes to mind, and otherwise expect to get a quick question or two along the way to make sure that we are responsive to what everyone's thinking.
That's great. Okay, well, our time is technically up. I think that was a great meeting. I particularly appreciated the deep dive into the educators. I, like Joan, want to echo gratitude and admiration for keeping the kind of systems building at the fore while we move through and continue to move through this crisis. So we will adjourn for now. I think I will be in touch on the parent fee piece. I'm thinking maybe a few of us may want to meet with Sarah Levy based on that letter and just better understand how she's thinking about the board's position on this, and but optional for sure. And I'll certainly be in touch. Thank you, Commissioner, team, Jocelyn, everybody. Take care.
Thank you.
Meeting adjourned.